Welcome everyone to the Transportation Commission meeting on December 9th. I'm calling this meeting to order at 6:01 p.m. Jennifer, could you please do a roll call?
Nick.
Here.
Skylar.
Here.
Andy.
Here.
Brett.
Here.
Brooke.
Here.
That's it.
All right. We have the agenda here. I'm seeking a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the agenda? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Passes unanimously. This is now the time for brief announcements from city staff, commissioners, and council member liaisons. Do commissioners have any announcements?
A couple on YOLO TD. There's some good news and some bad news. The good news is so the board did vote to expand express service to downtown Sacramento. So that's increasing the existing line 43, which is like downtown and East Davis, and then line 230, which is West Davis, from one round trip to 3 round trips per day, as well as restoring line 44, which goes to South Davis, which hadn't operated since before the pandemic, also with 3 round trips. But then the bad news is that, I guess because I think I said before, that like what they proposed, like it's been in the works to move the transit center in Woodland from County Fair Mall to downtown, but apparently there's like some NIMBY opposition to that in Woodland, so now staff are proposing to temporarily move that to the shopping center where Costco and Best Buy are, like in the far eastern part of Woodland instead. And then before ultimately moving it to, like there's a proposed affordable housing complex that would be near to the center of Woodland that it would get moved to further in the future, but that still is contingent on winning grants and stuff like that. But that's the more immediate proposal, and the board will be discussing potentially funding a study of that tonight at their meeting, which is also going on right now, so we'll see what happens with that. The next Citizens Advisory Committee meeting is Monday, January 6th at 6 p.m. and that's at YOLO TD headquarters in Woodland. So I think there'll be more discussion on this matter then as well.
Great, thank you, Andy. Any other announcements from commissioners? Okay, with that, Ryan or Jennifer, do you have any announcements?
Yeah, so I got a couple things. The first thing is our active transportation coordinator, Serena Rice. Last day was last Friday. So we will be going out to fill that position again sometime in the near future. The other thing I wanted to highlight is we are working on another grant opportunity. This time we will be putting together an active transportation plan that would update the Beyond Platinum Bikeways plan, include a more multimodal active transportation approach focusing on walking and pedestrians and scooters and some of the e-devices that we're starting to see. That grant application is actually through the Sustainable Transportation Planning Grant Program that Caltrans has, and that is due in late January, so hopefully we'll have some news on that in the spring. And then finally, I'm still waiting to hear from the Highway Safety Improvement Program about the grants we submitted last fall. I expect that'll probably be sometime after the first of the year.
Great. Jennifer, anything from you? All right, thank you very much. At this point, I'll open up the meeting for public comment. At this time, any member of the public may address the commission on matters which are not listed on the agenda or are listed on the consent calendar. Speakers will be limited to no more than 3 minutes, and speakers will be asked to speak at the podium up here and to state their name for the record. Is there any public comment this evening? Okay, I didn't see any public comment. So we'll move to the consent calendar. Items on the consent calendar are non-controversial and can be approved with one motion. Appears we just have our minutes from the previous 2 meetings on there. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve the consent calendar?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries unanimously. All right, moving right on. Next are our regular agenda items. For these items, we'll receive a presentation, and commissioners will have a chance to ask clarifying questions about the presentation and the staff report. Please hold all comments and discussion until after we hear public comment. Commissioners must be open to new ideas and listen to public comment. After public comment, we can then discuss the item and provide our comments. So we'll then go to our first item. Item A, city drive-through policies. Brian?
Yeah, so I have a verbal update on this one. And I think it was probably the September meeting, you had asked for an update on drive-through policies in the city. We did some research, reviewed the various plans, and the only location that we had a discussion of drive-throughs was actually the zoning ordinance, which is part of our municipal code, which allows drive-throughs in certain locations if they meet a set criteria that was attached as an attachment to the staff report. That is essentially my update. I have provided a couple different options depending on what the commission wants to do. One of the things I'm struggling with is this really isn't related to the transportation system and probably not in our purview, which is why my recommendations are either one, we incorporate it or request that it be incorporated into the general plan update, where it would be allowed to have a more vetted and community-wide discussion, or two, if you were looking for something a little more urgent than that, we could request that the planning commission take it up as a future item, depending on what your motion would be. I'm available if there's any questions.
Thank you. So do commissioners have any clarifying questions regarding the staff report?
I think one would be, so for like the planning commission approvals of drive-throughs, like how, in general, like how frequently do those types of things come up? And I know we had the recent one with Chipotle, but in general, is it, you say like there's one application a year, or how frequently would you say that?
I don't have any information on frequency. I've been with the city a little over 2.5 years now, and we've seen the Chipotle lane one, and then there's a Starbucks offer off of 2nd Street, but that's actually looking at occupying the Chase building, or Chase Bank that already has a drive-through. Those are the only two I'm aware of that have been contemplated. So I don't think it's very frequent.
I think it's my second follow-up question of your product, since it's not frequent, right? Answer won't be too surprising, but are you aware of like those, from what you know, like of those, has the planning commission ever denied a drive-through, or have they always tended to approve those?
Again, I don't have any knowledge of anything being denied by the planning commission. The way the municipal code set up on this one, if they meet the criteria that have been established, I think they would normally just be approved. I do, especially since COVID, normally ask for some detailed traffic information from drive-thrus in general. COVID has definitely changed the way people interact with fast food restaurants. We see a lot more drive-thru traffic, and I'm very worried about that traffic either blocking parking spaces in the parking lot, forcing more people to use the drive-thru, or potentially queuing out into the street. So I asked for some sort of letter or memo describing the operation, so we can make sure that's not going to happen.
Question on that, is that information you typically provide to the planning commission then on approval of, or for approval of particular projects?
When I see the drive-thru, the request for the new drive-thru, I normally ask for the applicant to prepare it. It's part of the project file. I would normally, if I catch it, ask for it to be attached to the planning commission's staff report. I think the second Chipotle appearance of the planning commission actually did include their memo on that. That one was a very unique setup where you had to order before you got in line, and they didn't have any good data points to kind of use from standard practices. So we had to rely on what the applicant had put together and then do a peer review.
You did mention in here that you had reviewed some of the various documents, including the climate action plan. Is any of the climate action plan included in the ordinance itself, or is that just a separate issue with regards to, what would happen with cars queuing and emissions and that type of thing?
Is the climate action plan included in the municipal code?
Yeah, is it just,
It's not part of the municipal code, it's a separate policy document.
okay.
The zoning ordinance really kind of gets into prescriptive uses for various land types and various parts of town based on the zoning of those parcels. And the climate action plan is really looking at policy and behavioral changes that we can implement.
Any other clarifying questions? At this time, is there any public comment regarding this? Just please come to the podium, give us your name.
I'm Alexander Whitmore, and my main question involving this, especially regarding the drive-throughs, is the question of considering the drive-through is already drastically increasing the vehicle throughput. My question is, is there a possibility that could result in a slight decrease in the amount of on-site parking requirements, since a lot more vehicles are just going to be moving through instead of having to be parked for people sitting down and eating in the establishment? I know there's only a few examples of drive-throughs in Davis, but it feels like something worth considering, since if that amount of parking was decreased slightly, a line of parking or so could be shifted around a bit to give extra room without having spiral queue for the drive-through to actually not go back into the street. I know it would be some weird mix of involvements from the zoning commission and whatnot, but it could be worth considering.
Great. Thank you very much. Is there any other public comment? Or actually, Ryan, with regards to that, is our on-site parking requirements different when you have a drive-through, or is that evaluated?
So yeah, there's been some research on that shows that on-site parking requirements are different with and without a drive-through. Off-street, excuse me. A lot of that data is before COVID and before DoorDash, and traffic patterns around fast food restaurants have just changed so drastically that I'm kind of skeptical to say that it's still accurate. And a lot of that, especially with DoorDash, is the drive-thrus for customers that show up. They want the meal delivery services to park, walk in, pick up the food from the counter, and then leave, which is changing the way a lot of these businesses, the traffic patterns around these businesses are changing. There's not a lot of research I've found that really looks at that, considering it's only been around or an issue for about 18 months.
Great, thank you. Is there any discussion from commissioners? Andy?
Yeah, I think just a couple of thoughts. One thing is, I would say that drive-throughs, I think the drive-throughs are transportation infrastructure. The staff report here implies that they're more like the land use pattern, but I'd say it's more, even though they're not directly owned by the city, they're still transportation infrastructure. And a parallel would be like I-80, which still, the city doesn't own it, the Caltrans owns it, but it still is transportation infrastructure that has with the overflow traffic and whatnot, still has a big impact on the city-owned transportation system. Drive-throughs are similar. They're essentially a privately owned traffic lane that also impacts flow in publicly owned, like bike lanes and traffic lanes. So with that, I thought that I would have is that I would hope that staff consider, and I don't want to be micromanaging or anything, but I would hope that staff consider some modifications to the approval process, with the thought in mind that this is transportation infrastructure, it's not just a land use thing. So as you move forward with this, considering involving the Transportation Commission in an appropriate way, since we bring that expertise on just how transportation infrastructure works and how it might impact, and our experiences of how drive-throughs might impact, like the city-owned transportation infrastructure, as we already see on places like Olive Drive with In-N-Out. I mean, it is common, and that's an especially important bike corridor now that the new ramp connector to the pole line overcrossing is there. But with In-N-Out, like you see the cars backing up into the bike lane, and even like the bike lanes, like there's some huge like bumps and worn out pavement. I think because there's been so much queuing in that bike lane, so that's just one example of how drive-throughs again function as transportation infrastructure. So I would ask that staff consider an appropriate way of acknowledging that and involving the Transportation Commission in the approval process accordingly. Otherwise, I mean, of course, I think more generally, I think it would be a great thing to consider as part of the, I think just looking at more general, like zoning and citywide policy, it would be a great thing to consider as part of the general plan update. And I think, the main concern that I have about drive-throughs is, a place not having a drive-through doesn't preclude someone from, it can still be very easy for someone to drive to a place, park there, and go patronize a business, even if it doesn't have a drive-through. But if a place becomes dependent on a drive-through, and this is something we really saw during COVID, it can become something that excludes people. It's not really something that provides better accommodation for people who drive than not having a drive-through, but it can exclude people who don't drive. And we saw this, not just with fast food places, but even with vital services like, COVID tests and vaccines. I will say, I think like the Davis, like Healthy Davis Together things were great that you could walk in, but in much of the country, you saw like even vital services like that, like you couldn't utilize them unless you were in a car, which became a big problem. So just a more general thing to consider with drive-throughs, they are, it is something that I feel is more like exclusive than inclusive.
Thank you.
So when you ask for some additional information from the applicant, is it a requirement or is it sort of if they wish to provide?
It's a requirement.
And the level is like rough number of customers per hour frequenting the business by vehicle, or at what level of detail is it?
Normally what I end up asking for is I want to know what the length of the queue is going to be 95% of the time. So I'm looking at a maximum queue length.
And are they typically equipped to do that in a scientific fashion, or do you get the sense that they're sort of, kind of making the numbers up?
They normally hire some sort of a transportation planner or engineer to do the analysis for them. It's something that we can normally verify or at least peer review to make sure there's some degree of accuracy to it. Some of the concerns is the difference in activity between a McDonald's and an In-N-Out or anything like that can be very, very different. And so we end up relying on data specific to the type of business that is a lot more than I would like to. But in an absence of anything better, we're at least able to get some assurance that we're not going to have issues with traffic queuing onto the street or other undesirable things.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that this commission is really the one to evaluate kind of this sufficiency of their layout plans, but I feel like if they do provide quality information to you, you would be able to flag if there seems to be a mismatch. However, kind of a bigger picture thing, and this commission might be the one to do that. I'm reminded of Dutch Brothers, and Dutch Brothers has created some problematic traffic flow. I guess it would be northbound on Richards, people making the legal left turn into Dutch Brothers. Also, as the queue gets longer, it blocks Olive, and it's created a bunch of problems there with just poor behavior. I'm not sure that we would notice that when the original application came through, because of the projections are projections, and there can be a mismatch. So what might be worth thinking about is, and I'm sure this body would be supportive of it if you came back with a proposal where the applicant had to specifically provide certain sets of information and kind of like we've done with some of the apartments in the past, where we estimated the traffic flow in and out of the parking structure. If it went beyond that, then the applicant would be required to do some, demand management. Now, that's really more of from the parking perspective, but with Dutch Brothers, for instance, our tools are very limited in the sense that, the police can go and issue citations. They can go to the business and say, you're creating a nuisance, but they're kind of blunt, somewhat clumsy instruments. And it seems like, there probably is an appetite to maybe fine-tune the requirements so that we're better able to make sure, and perhaps there's a 3-month period where we examine, the actual flows versus projected flows from the applicant. But keeping in mind, we don't want to create too many administrative hurdles and delays when somebody is, just by nature of adding a drive-through window. Having said that, I think to Andy's point, maybe in the general plan there can be discussion about, how we prioritize, the various modes of transportation, making use of some of these places, especially when they're kind of greenfield sites. Anyway, I guess for me the key thing would be, do you feel like the applicants are providing you the tools so that you have a pretty good sense of the adequacy of the layout?
Yes, I do.
Scott?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I don't personally feel as though drive-throughs, I can appreciate the points that were made by Andy, and I can understand there's a tangential relationship between drive-throughs and traffic and transportation. But I'm not really, offended by the idea that this is primarily a land use issue and doesn't necessarily need a third or fourth level of review at the Transportation Commission level. I think the Planning Commission and staff are probably the appropriate places to look at drive-throughs most of the time. That said, if there was going to be some discussion, some effort to shore up or alter or amend, the city's rules regarding drive-throughs, I think it'd be, perfectly appropriate for the commission to take a look at those policies as they get developed. But I would say I don't necessarily think that this is hugely that this ought to be a big concern of this commission most of the time. Although I agree that in and out is really poorly designed situation, and it has been since 1999 when it went in and I went in. But I remember when it went in because we on the drive to Tahoe we stopped. We're like, there's In-N-Out Davis now. Screw you, Murder Burger. That's an old school Davis reference. Murder Burger, yeah. It became Red Run Burger, and I think now it's nothing. But In-N-Out killed that. Anyway, that's my piece.
So I was kind of the one that asked about putting this on here, and I do agree this probably is very much a land use issue, and I think that was one of my concerns with the Chipotle project coming into South Davis, because we have a really high concentration of freeway serving drive-through type businesses there. And there are impacts to that, and I think one of them just from the standpoint of not only just the traffic impact, but there's also impacts with, regards to, a lot of garbage that gets thrown around from people who are picking stuff up and then just leaving it on the street or whatever. And, it is a very high concentration there. And I know that there are in other areas like Sacramento, has often found that, drive-through projects are incompatible with a downtown type area, because it does impact the way people perceive the use of the streets, the sidewalks, with having cars coming in and out of those areas. And I think, in the case of the one where they're taking over the Chase Bank, the drive-through demand on a bank is obviously quite different than a drive-through demand on a Starbucks, which is constant. So, you know, I understand that it's definitely a land use issue. I do agree that at some level there are transportation impacts that would be good, you know, if we do send us to a general plan discussion, that I think there should be input from this commission, you know, regarding how we look at transportation issues with drive-throughs. So, you know, with that, the staff presented the two options here. And I think that it does seem like this is a general plan issue that we would want to, and I guess the question would be, do we want to add the option one, adding a city staff discussion of drive-throughs as part of the general plan update efforts? I mean, I would definitely support that. I think it's important for us to look at that. I think as Ryan, you pointed out, there's a lot of changes in people's relationship to these sort of establishments, and there's probably a lot more demand for having some sort of drive-through, drive-up kind of situation. So I definitely think that we should recommend that this become a part of the general plan update. And I don't know if anyone wants to make a motion to that effect, but I certainly think that would be the way we'd like to go. I would like to go.
I'll make a motion that we ask staff to pursue option one as presented in our staff report.
Is there a second?
I'll second that motion. I guess one potential amendment I invite folks to consider, just given that, even if it's primarily a land use issue, there are some transportation impacts. So do you want to add an additional recommendation that at least like maybe one of us be a liaison to the planning commission when drive-through applications come their way? Is that something folks would be open to or interested in?
I think those are public meetings and any of us can attend them if we want to.
Yeah, I think that would be, I think that we could certainly provide input. I'm not sure having establishing some sort of a, you know, particular, you know, rule or whatever that is, but I think, you know, we could certainly provide input, and I think it would be good for us to be made aware when those issues are coming up. So.
Sounds good.
So we have a motion and a second, I believe, on option one. Is there any discussion? Any further discussion? Okay, with that, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Carries unanimously.
Before we move on to the next one, Andy, you know, one of the ways we might deal with some of these transportation-related for items that are the purview of other commissions, but we feel like there's a transportation component that's important for us. Perhaps, you know, for instance, some of these larger, you know, or things we hear about well in advance, this body could kind of designate a spokesperson to go. And so not, you know, an official requirement, but we could say, oh, Andy, you know, all those in favor of Andy going and speaking on conveying the information from a recent discussion about drive-throughs. You know, I think we could probably give you some higher standing than just member of the public.
Yeah.
Councilmember?
Yeah, thanks. I just had a couple of questions related to, for you, Ryan, related to the public comment that was made earlier. So you were saying not enough data is available on how on-site parking requirements should be adjusted, but then in response to Brett's question about whether you were getting data on adequacy, you were saying roughly is okay. You sort of felt like you were getting a picture of that. So that was one part of the question is, can the sort of sentiments of the business owners be used to guide us in how we might want to shift on-site parking requirements? And then two, if so, what is actually the process? Which commissions, how does that happen?
Okay, starting with the data, prior to COVID, we really had two tools. We had a lot of statutory parking requirements based on X thousand square feet. You need to have 2.3 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet, or whatever the standard was. That was normally defined in code. We also had a parking generation manual that's put together and published by the Institute of Transportation Engineers, ITE. They also put together the trip generation information. Anytime you heard the traffic engineer say single-family residence produces 10 trips a day, came from the ITE publication. The parking generation manual really does cover a lot of land uses and does a real good job with them. The drive-through thing has just been insane since COVID. For a while there, these were the only restaurants that were open, only the drive-through window was open. People just that would normally go into the restaurant just started getting used to the drive-through windows. I'm also seeing a lot of innovative drive-through designs that are coming in. We're seeing a lot more multiple points where orders are being taken. We're seeing a lot of restaurants that have just been torn back down to their foundations and rebuilt, so the drive-through restaurant can put in a second kitchen, one just to handle the drive-through and one to handle the front of the store. And that's really kind of changing the way and the number of people they can serve, and a lot of that data hasn't been updated. And then we're seeing a lot of things like Chipotle, where you can't even order, you have to order with the app and then drive through to pick it up. I don't have good data on any of those kind of innovations in drive-thrus. I now know a lot more about drive-thrus than I did 2 years ago, and restaurant design, but in that case, I'm really relying on them to present me data. Normal approach is they hire somebody to go out there as a consultant and analyze various restaurants throughout the region that use the same business model they are to come up with an idea of what kind of drive-through stacking they're seeing. I really want to see it at 95%. I don't want it to be this, well, half the time it's fine and half the time it's not. I've seen a lot of these operations where you start stacking traffic into the driveway, or into the parking lot, excuse me, which makes it hard to access those parking spaces, so you're just feeding more traffic into the drive-through. And then that's where I get real concerned, because now I've got a drive-through queue that's on the street and causing problems for just through traffic and train movements and sight distance and blocking bike lanes and all the things we don't want to see. I'm in a position where I have to rely on their data. I feel they give me good data. They give me data where I can review it and make sure it's accurate. I'm not watching them count every car in the queue, but everything's been peer reviewed. It's as accurate and honest as we can make it. And for the most part, that's worked fairly well with the recent types of drive-through projects I've seen. Did that answer it?
Yeah, and what's the second part? The second question was, if we were to modify on-site parking requirements, what is the process? Is that purely staff decision, then comes council, or is it code?
I think that would really be part of the application and something that the planning commission would take up, but I'd have to do some more research.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. With that, I think we'll move to the next agenda item, which is the follow-up from the October commission meeting on Fifth Street, L Street to Cantrell Drive improvement project. And this is just an informational item, right? Or are you looking for a recommendation?
What was that?
I'm sorry, it's listed as informational item, and so this is just information with feedback is what you're looking for?
I'm looking for feedback, yeah.
Okay.
I just the same carried over from the last meeting where we discussed this. Ultimately, it will be approved by the city council, but I would like some direction. So at the last meeting, we updated the Fifth Street update. We looked at essentially what the cross-section was coming out of the community input and our last discussion with you all, or with the BTSSC. And then we looked at a couple intersection designs. Based on that, we had two questions that came up. The first one was why a cycle track on the south side of the road? And then the second one was relating to the bike lane on the north side of the road and whether or not it should be parking protected. So a couple exhibits put together. This one, let me get my mouse. Every red X is a driveway. This is pole line here. This is L Street. The two-way facility we were proposing was on the south side here, specifically because it didn't have near as many driveway crossings as the north side. And especially if you were coming off of Pauline, coming off of the bridge, or coming out of South Davis, we minimize the number of conflicts you might have with vehicles entering or exiting a driveway. We got to the intersection of Fifth and Elm, and we had some intersection improvements that could help either shift you back into the bike lane, or you would go down L Street to get to Third Street if you were headed downtown. I still think that the cycle track on the south side being two-way has a lot of benefits, specifically to avoid a lot of these conflicts, and it helps address a lot of those concerns. This one is a little hard to read, I apologize. Just looking at the area with the concentration of driveways, we did put together this exhibit showing what parking protected would look like. We also attached to the staff report a bunch of data. This was real close to my office, so I had an intern out there multiple times a day, counting the number of cars that were actually parked there. Very well utilized parking, very well utilized, probably as well utilized or slightly better than some areas downtown. In order to set this up in such a way that vehicles that are entering or exiting the driveway, but especially exiting, are able to see, we would end up losing about 2 parking spaces. But I'm also very concerned that I'd have vehicles stopped in the bike lane, waiting for a break in traffic before they try to turn and continue on their business. My preference would be to keep the parking adjacent to the curb and not parking protect this one, just because of those driveways, creating that second kind of decision point where we got automobiles staging the crossing across the bike lane and then into or across the travel lane if this median gets removed, and just kind of the operational issues that would cause. Really, it's because of the number of driveways. I think there are other locations in town where parking protected bike lanes are advantageous, and we should be looking at them. This is just an exhibit of what the proposal we were looking at for the modified solution. This is long-term. This is grant funded to remove some curves and reconstruct the road. For 3B, 3A is just paint and something that we could implement quickly. I really wanted to stress in 3B, we're removing the existing 12-foot trail, replacing it with a wide sidewalk, and then elevating that cycle track to be at the same elevation as the sidewalk. Really helping further reduce the width of the street, really trying to kind of control the speeds on this road, but creating that buffer for the bicyclists, and it doesn't fundamentally change what's out there right now where we've got that multi-use trail on the south side of the street. The other thing that if the commission's ready to discuss are some of these intersection treatments. This is L Street at 5th, and we're really looking at a partially protected intersection at the right versus a exclusive pedestrian bypass. And really the exclusive pedestrian bypass, what I was really wanting to consider is making it red for all the automobiles. No right turns on red, no red through. We'd allow bicyclists and pedestrians to enter the intersection, cross at this diagonal that we're showing here if they wanted to continue to head west in the bike lane without any conflicts, versus the more traditional staged crossing you would see with a protected intersection. Finally, the other thing that came up was a discussion about pole line at 5th. And this is again the concept of what the protected intersection would look like. It includes, especially because we're coming off of a 2-way cycle track here as well as this, or a multi-use trail, 2 directions of travel for the bicyclists across the intersection on these approaches, and then just a single stage crossing, or single direction for the stage crossing along the other 2 links of the intersection. Versus the proposed roundabout, which does include a free right turn here. When we were looking at traffic operations without this free right, we started seeing excessive queuing. Essentially, the demand exceeded the capacity for the intersection. And then we would start seeing queuing. I've got a lot of concerns. This is a primary response route for emergency services. This is between the police station and City Hall. This is one of those intersections where I need to be able to make it so that vehicles can get through. I do agree that I'm not crazy about having that free right there, and my recommendation would be to pursue the signalized option here over the roundabout. I do want to stress that all of these improvements are going to require grant money. The grant situation for active pedestrian type of projects has not been great over the last 9 months. The state has had to reduce funding into like the ATP grant program, active transportation program, excuse me, and some other programs. And with the change in leadership in Washington, I'm not sure what the future of transportation grant funding is going to be over the next few years. We're probably, and I have other grant priorities throughout the city that are probably going to take precedence for local funds, such as funding or fully funding the Olive Connector for the Amtrak ADA project, connecting Olive Drive with a pedestrian bike connection under the railroad overpass and into the Amtrak station and other points in Davis. That being said, I'm probably looking at the interim improvements that we're seeing on the street. We do have some money to restripe option 3A or some modified version of it in the near term. Probably remove the fence that's separating the existing multi-use path from the street. And then starting the design on some of the signal improvements if that's the way the commission and the council would like to go. That's really the extent of my presentation, if there's any questions.
Are there any clarifying questions from commissioners?
I have a quick one. On option 3A, I see a vertical element in the striped area, and it says existing. Did I?
That's the existing roadway width. There are no delineators. We would add those vertical, maybe plastic tubular delineators if this was pursued.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question on the L Street scramble configuration, and you put that as sort of a near-term solution. I'm assuming that's going to require some significant signal modification there that would have to be, that's not just like, hey, I mean, there's...
It's probably $300,000 or $400,000 worth of intersection design improvements, additional signal heads. I'm gonna have to rewire some stuff. That's an old enough intersection that I'm probably gonna have to pull more copper conductor in order to energize everything.
Yeah, I have one on the parking protection part. And it's basically, so you mentioned that you'd expect with this configuration that's shown here that cars would enter the bike lane, kind of wanting to turn. My question is basically, how hard would it be to like extend the sight lines so that that doesn't happen? And then with this configuration so that there is no parking protection for the bike lane, is there adequate sight lines to kind of ensure that people can see what they need to without entering?
This design removes 2 parking spaces. It has adequate sight lines for the speed limit. What I've seen with other installations throughout the region is the cars still try to do it as a staged crossing. They'll cross into the bike lane to try to see even further down the street. And the back of the car now blocks the bike lane. In order for me to open up the sight lines enough that they feel comfortable trying to do this as a single crossing instead of trying to stage it, I'm going to be removing a lot more parking spaces. I want to talk to the businesses about that. I'm not kidding. We were seeing 80 to 100% parking occupancy every time we went out there to count. It's very well used.
Are there any other clarifying questions? Okay, with that, we'll open up for public comment. Is there any public comment on this item?
So, from my understanding of this, you mainly looked at the public parking occupancy just in isolated, counting the cars as, in the car spaces. My major question is, have there been considerations for what other streets would most likely end up having more parking usage on them if the nuclear option of just completely cutting the parking on both sides was considered? And the related thing of trying to stop vehicles from rolling up into the bike lane by simply, as they do in some places like Denmark, slightly raising the bicycle path, just so there's like a clear distinction between when the driveway begins and when the bicycle lane and the sidewalk ends. I've seen things in the Netherlands that were specifically made so that the sidewalk would continue to be raised, while vehicles would have to go over a slight bump to clearly demark that it was the pedestrian path first, instead of with the cars having to be aware of that. It wouldn't fix the sightline issue, but it would clearly signal that they can't just scoot into it as at will. There's also the related thing of regarding the roundabout and specifically emergency vehicles. Yet again, in the Netherlands, many times they end up being used by emergency services for faster response times, specifically because those are the only lanes where vehicles aren't going to be, even during rush hour times, even when there's queues. So there is the option where instead of just turning back away from the roundabout, we just slightly widen the pedestrian path, wide enough for a police car and an ambulance, and just plan around that instead. I know that would definitely cost even more money, but it's something worth considering as a plan C, since A and B are already clearly marked and planned.
Thank you very much. Ryan, did you want to?
Yeah, so I didn't look at what would happen if we removed the parking and where the additional vehicles would be displaced to. I suspect it would be somewhere on L Street, since that's the closest place for them to be, or potentially in front of the garden. I also didn't look at running emergency vehicles on the trail system. It's not something we've historically done in Davis, and it would require some additional thought.
Great, thank you. Okay, is there any additional public comment? Okay, if there's no additional public comment on this issue. We'll open it up for discussion by commissioners. Is there any?
I'll kick it off, a couple of thoughts. So firstly, I agree with staff that I think this is, in general, I think a two-way cycle track does make, on the south side of the street, does make sense as part of this project. I think that also thinking back to some of the concerns that folks had about it last time, I think that personally, I think one challenge right now of biking, in this case, it's going westbound on the cycle track, but when you're biking against the kind of contraflow to traffic, a challenge is that, and I was actually reading an article about this recently, is car headlights have gotten a lot brighter in recent years, and at night that can make it quite hard to see when you're biking, even with a good light, especially when you're going contraflow. So I'm wondering if there are any options that the city might have to, of course, I think, one option is just if the street's well lit, that can reduce that impact a bit. But also, if there's any options, with signage to at least, discourage folks from having their high beams on, stuff like that. But if there's been staff have looked at all of that area. So that's one question. And then the other is, I think is the other which I brought up last time also, there could be a potential alternative. This is thinking longer term, but looking at improving the bike lane on 2nd Street on the north side, because that's another option, especially if you're coming from Pole Line. That's another good way of getting downtown, is using that, and then looking at a potential protected intersection at L and 3rd. it's just another, so I'm curious if that's been looked at at all as part of this.
Starting with the Second Street one, we did not look at that as part of this project. It's definitely something we want to look at as part of this other grant opportunity I was talking about a little bit earlier. As far as the headlights, that's something I want to look into in a little more detail. They shouldn't be using their headlights in an urban environment. For option 3B with the ultimate build, we'd have to install additional lighting, and we could address it there. I'm very reluctant to tell motorists not to use safety devices on their cars with a sign, just because that can become a liability issue for the city.
The other commissioner comments? Brett? Oh, sorry. Nick, did you?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment about the parking protected bike lane concept. And a little background. So I was on the city council when we were coming up with the design for the South Mace improvement, lovingly called the Mace Mess. And we were in a meeting, the people shall remain unnamed other than myself. And one of the people talking to us about the concept mentioned, oh, parking protected bike lane. And I said, oh wow, those are really cool. They do those in Portland. Yeah, we should do that. That was the level of analysis. And if you look at the parking protected bike lanes on the South Mace, it kind of begs the question, which is, what problem are you trying to solve with the parking protected bike lane? And are there better places or, situations that are more correct for that solution versus less correct? Because every tool has its pluses and minuses. So just to cut to the chase in South Mace, those cars don't move. They're in front of single-family residential, homes. There's leaves under the tires, there's cobwebs, there's maybe 1 or 2 movements from the curb of that vehicle per day, if that. And so the solution, which it's trying to address, it isn't a problem there. And at kind of the level of analysis I was operating on was sort of the shiny object phenomenon. Like, oh, yeah, great. When we look at what's proposed, if you can go to the next slide, Ryan. Maybe the next slide. Yep, that's the one. So, what are we trying to solve with the parking protected bike lane? And are there situations where it's more appropriate or less appropriate? As I look at this, I'm not too concerned about losing a couple parking spaces, but what I am concerned is not necessarily the number of driveways, but the fact that these are not like a single family house driveway, but these are commercial establishments with a fair amount of in and out traffic. So if we just sort of pick directly above where it says 5th Street, and imagine we're heading westbound on 5th Street, and there's cars in those parking spaces, and the data that was provided showed that more often than not, these parking spaces are well utilized. You're a cyclist heading west. There's a westbound car at the same time, roughly even with you, and it wants to turn right into one of these driveways to one of these commercial establishments, which will happen on an ongoing basis. It's not just a homeowner returning home at 3 times per day. And you are hidden. You're sort of just, it's as if you're going through 10 different intersections on what would normally be a fairly, uneventful journey, because you're hidden from view by the cars. Whereas if the cars would be in the more traditional place against the curb, as you're riding along, and the striping shows a fairly generous, or I won't say generous, I'll get in trouble, but a reasonable sized bike lane. You are visible from far away. You're visible as the car approaches. You're visible when the car wants to make that right-hand movement. And so there's a high amount of visibility, so it isn't as if you're going through 10 intersections. There's visibility in a variety of ways. And the cars moving westbound are traveling at speed as opposed to the cars coming out of the driveways wanting to either turn right or, do whatever they're going to do. And so I would say that as a tool, a parking protected bike lane, to me, being slightly better informed than I was 8 years ago, is slightly problematic. I'm not an expert, but I do, little red lights kind of flash on my screen when I look at this design, because I think we will create more problems than we're solving. So I would say that at this stage, without further expert guidance really telling us like this is an important solution addressing a very significant problem, I see this as creating more problems. Again, not as an expert, but as a slightly better informed person than I was, 8 years ago. Anyway, for that reason, I would say that we don't move forward with this aspect of the plan, because I don't believe that this section is fairly problematic. And I think it just opens the door for more problems.
Well, I guess I'll respond. I actually like the parking protected one on South Mesa. I drive down there. I ride my bike there all the time, and given a lot of the conditions around town, I like the idea that cars are not going in and out of the bike lane there. That it is protected. I understand your concerns on this, and I think it's a really good observations. I think the other side of it, and it definitely does need to probably a little bit further look at all this, is that because you do have cars coming, parking and coming out all the time, you do have more conflicts, not just then at the intersections, but then also with the cars that are parking along there that are coming across the bike lane, obviously the door opening and that sort of thing. So, I think there's definitely trade-offs, and it's a good observation, but I also think that there's a lot of issues with going back and forth across that bike lane and putting bicyclists in that position. My other comment was just that I really do like the scramble approach down there as opposed to the more traditional go this way, go that way. At L Street, I would prefer that as an option as a cyclist, because it just makes that a more direct and faster transition to that other side there. So I think that's a good approach. Anyway, those are my two comments on it.
Thank you. So following to your comment on the headlight issue, I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't suggesting that people be told not to use their headlights at all. It's just about it's just that in places where there's two-way cycle traffic on one side of the street, it just is like high beam lights. Because I've been reading that, and it actually has become an increasing problem recently that people just use their high beams on city streets at night. And part of that is because in general, car headlights have gotten a lot brighter. But I just wanted to clarify that and just wanted to make a clarification there. It sounds like that might not have come across clearly, so apologies about that. Then the second on the parking protected issue, I'll second my colleague's comment here that I think, in general, the Mace protected bike lanes are a huge improvement over what was there before. So I think that definitely was not an error, and that was a good project. And I think, as I've said before, some of the criticism that's happened about that, it's just, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, it's NIMBY BS. So I think in general, it's not that it's just that I don't think it's a situation where just that's a situation where a parking protected bike lane has been quite effective. In this situation, definitely, of course, the driveways do make it more challenging, so I acknowledge that. I will say that one thing, just in my general experience, riding and unprotected, I've just been riding bikes around town and other places, it's definitely in general, while protected bike lanes aren't a complete solution, they still can certainly get blocked by cars. It's a much more common problem in unprotected bike lanes for a variety of reasons, in my experience. But in this situation specifically, I'm curious, would there be any opportunity, because there are so many driveways here, are there situations where some of those can be consolidated and ultimately there could be fewer of them, where there might be opportunities for, if one business has multiple driveways, there might be an opportunity for a couple to share a driveway or stuff like that. Has that been looked at all?
Yes, there's opportunities for driveway consolidation. I really need for these projects to come in for redevelopment or change in land use or some other kind of permit request in order to start that discussion. It's gonna take years, it's not necessarily that easy, especially when the business already has access, ask them to give that up and do a shared driveway with somebody else. But you are correct, I mean, Fifth Street acting kind of as an arterial that moves traffic through town. Modern access management would not have this many driveways there for those very reasons.
Other commissioner input? Nick? You good?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. So Ryan, do you have, is there anything else that you want from the commission at this point, or is this feedback helpful?
This feedback's helpful, you've given me a bit to think about. I don't, if the commission had any input about the intersection design at Pole Line, I'd be interested in that.
I mean, I'll just, in response to that, I personally, I mean, I like roundabouts in general. I think they're a good traffic control device. I think that this, as we discussed last time, this particular intersection that may be difficult to achieve, given some of the right-of-way issues and acquisition that might be needed for that. And like you said, there's definitely an issue of, this is a main access road for emergency vehicles and things like that. So that in this case, I don't know, maybe the roundabout is not going to be the preferred solution, and maybe a more traditional signalized one might be the way we would come down on that. Yeah, I just think there's some things about that particular intersection with the roundabout that might be problematic.
Kind of like roundabouts, I don't love how California drivers use them. Yeah, it's, I guess I would say I was skeptical of this roundabout before, and agree with Ryan's kind of take on it.
Awesome, thank you.
Andy, do you?
Yeah, one quick thing, and I think I brought this up before, but just wanted to raise it again to keep it on folks' minds, is that, I think I do prefer, I think that given the two options presented, like the the signalized protected intersection is preferable to the roundabout with the free right turn. But also one thing that could potentially, just given the design of this intersection, could help, and especially with some of the connections to the pole line overpass, or for someone going westbound on 5th Street, is coordinating with Sudwork to make it, to improve there, because right now you have to go across, if you want to go underneath pole line, you have the gravel parking lot you have to deal with, which can be very bumpy, especially if you don't have a gravel bike. But that's something that if there were a project there to improve that parking lot and potentially even add some kind of bike infrastructure component to it, that could be great in terms of, again, the connection, I think, especially between the pole line bike path, if you're coming up down the overcrossing and then want to continue north on pole line, or if you're going westbound on 5th Street. It could be a great way to simplify the crossing versus having to navigate the intersection.
Okay, if there's no other comments, I think we'll close that item and move on to the next item on our agenda, which will be Public Works Section 5, Transportation Systems Design Standards Cleanup. Ryan?
So as a little bit of history, over the last few months, we've received a few requests about specifically curb ramps that were being placed and why they weren't consistent with the design standards. In most cases, that was because there was either a drainage feature that we could not relocate, or in one case, a fire hydrant. And you would not believe how expensive it is to move a fire hydrant. So I was digging into this, and there were a couple things that kind of needed to be updated. The first one is we don't have a design exception process. And a design exception is really, Caltrans and a lot of public works agencies use this as a way to document when we have to deviate from standard. It documents why we have to, what standard we're deviating from, why we're deviating from it, any anticipated impacts to safety as a result, and kind of gets into the cost question. The other issue we had is there was some language in here that referenced either back to the BTSSC or the city council for check-ins on very specific project features or elements. BTSSC doesn't exist anymore, and when I was digging into this, it seemed like the design exception process plus our regular check-ins on these types of projects are probably sufficient. And I wanted to discuss that with you, get some feedback on this for potentially taking it to the city council in early 2025. The other thing I want and I need for this is some transparency. We can't just be approving design exceptions in a vacuum. You all need to know what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so part of this would be check-ins periodic with the commission, just summarizing what design exceptions have been approved and why. I am envisioning that as something that happens every 3 or 4 months, because I don't think we're really doing a lot of these. And probably on the consent agenda is just an update from staff with the commission pulling items as they see fit. If you want to go into the details of the changes, I can. The big one is really adding this language about what the design exception would be, removal of some language that's not popping out to me at the moment. Some language here where we're talking about coming back to the BTSSC or City Council. And then, is this a full document?
Oh, it's just.
For the sorry, I'm looking for my,
Exceptions.
yeah,
Go to the Word document.
my Word document, thank you. This is a design exception format that I knocked together. It's still draft. I think there's going to be 2 of them. There's going to be one for city-driven and led CIP projects. And I'm going to have another one for any design exceptions for any of the developments that private developers might be doing. The big change between the 2 of them is going to be that I want the developer's engineer to fill out the design exception for the city to approve. It's not something I expect staff to be completing. But really, like I said, getting into what is a non-standard feature, what are we exempting from, the reason we need to do it, added cost, and then I expect them to document that for each deviation that we're seeing in the field. And this would not cover changes that need to be made during construction. If we have an unsuitable soil issue or there's some hidden utility that comes to bear when we're in construction, there's a field direction process that normally covers those changes when we need to make them. And because that needs to move a little bit quicker than this process will, I would not be modifying or changing that.
Okay, so I do have one clarifying question. So in taking all the reference to the review by BTSSC, now Transportation Commission out, and what you're saying then is that all the design exceptions would be approved by you, the city engineer.
Well,
But there would just be a report to us on some periodic basis about design exceptions that have been approved?
yeah, I'm not the city engineer, Diana Jensen is
Oh,
Public
sorry.
Works Director, city engineer, but yes, you would still see projects, you'd see them at a high level like we just did with Fifth Street, where I'd be bringing you concepts, I'd be bringing you kind of proposals, intersection designs that need to be changed, but like the nuts and bolts design on how we make that vision fit the street, you would not be involved with. You would see regular updates on anything we had to deviate from. You could always ask us to bring something back to you that was specific. In the same vein, the city council ultimately approves the final plan set for bid and award, so they would still be seeing these projects at that stage, as well as any check-ins that need to be done on some of the larger projects like Mace.
Any other clarifying questions? Is there any public comment on this item? There is no public comment, so we'll move to, is there any discussion from the commission regarding this, regarding the changes? Brett?
I'm supportive of the changes, but it presupposes somebody with some level of reasonable expertise. And not to, in the past, there have been occasions where that level of expertise probably didn't exist among city staff. And not to be negative or hostile, we've had some open positions before and things like that. So, I mean, I'm comfortable with you and your manager kind of being the ones and reporting back kind of after the fact. But I do, there have been designs that have been changed after the concept has been presented to the city council and some of the details chosen have been problematic. Jennifer can probably think of a few of the designs, just like Covell and J, Covell and L, where the concept seemed fairly sound, but the actual implementation, when people want to go out and see what happened, you're just kind of like, how'd this happen? I don't have those concerns with the two of you on the team, but, and I don't know that the BTSSC or this commission would be the one to spot those details, but I did want to voice that there have been gaps in the past.
Any other comments from commissioners? Any other discussion? So I think, is there anything else you're looking for from us?
Yeah, I forgot to talk about one thing. I got a little too excited about my design acceptance form. And I would be looking at a motion or some sort of consensus, if there is one, to take this to the council. One of the other things I am looking at is asking for minor modifications, or the ability for the public works director and city engineer to make minor modifications to this document as we need to. And by that I mean minor. One of the references that I caught when I was updating this is it referred to the Caltrans traffic manual. Caltrans traffic manual hasn't existed since 2000. It's been superseded by another document. So just kind of catching those things like the daylighting law where state law has changed, if we need to make changes here to make sure we are in alignment with state law. I'd like to be able to do that at a staff level, just to kind of try to speed things up a little bit and make us a little more agile and efficient.
I'd swing that by the city attorney's office and have them draft that for you.
Okay.
So I guess we're looking for some recommendation to take this to the city council then? Do we need a motion to do that? Would you prefer a motion to do that? Yes. Would someone like to move that this document then be forwarded to the city council for approval?
So moved.
Is there a second?
No. Go ahead.
Been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the motion? If there's no discussion, all in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
We might, Ryan talked about minor changes. That can be a little bit in the eye of the beholder, right? So we might want to add,
I really think that the city attorney's office should be the ones to address how to,
right, but so for instance, what, so bike lane width is 7 feet. We ask 10 people out on the street and like changing that to 6 for a segment, and they're like, oh yeah, sure. Whereas, the bike advocacy community will come here with pitchforks and torches, going for 7 to 6 to make room for just something, like that can be considered quite a big deal. And I understand what you're saying about kind of legal, but I think maybe we add an addendum to our separate motion, which is the intent is supposed to remain there. So, we want to have more room for the drive lanes for the vehicles or motorized vehicles. So, it's a little snug, so we'll take it away from the bike lane. Like, no, I think the street standards were provided or created in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears from others because, they really were willing to die on the hill for 7 feet versus 6 feet. And so maybe just a little segment, and I'll make a motion that along with our recommendation to council to adopt this, that we emphasize that this is to make minor or clarifying adjustments on an as-needed basis with clear reason for doing so.
Is there a second to
Yeah, I mean,
the addendum of the motion? I mean, we're pretty much.
not to borrow their phrase, but you kind of get the word solid intent.
Yeah, I would, sorry, I know there's not, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, is there discussion? I'll discuss. So, I mean, the way I understood, Ryan, what you were saying in terms of minor changes would be if there were technical issues regarding changes in the particular municipal code that's being referenced, or like you said, the Caltrans code, or if there are the difference between street or streets, or, things like that. And I think that we're definitely comfortable with that. I agree with Brett, though, that it is kind of a slippery slope to say, well, it is minor, 1 foot here or there on a technical specification, or which I don't think is the intent of allowing minor changes. It's more like just to make sure it's consistent with other documents, other issues that might be outside of the standards themselves.
Correct. And I totally understand and agree with the need to put some guardrails on that intent. So what I'm hearing is we're okay with clarification, conformance with other regulatory documents that supersede it. We're not okay with changing right-of-way widths or lane widths or sidewalk widths or anything like that.
Specifics of the standards, yeah. Is the consensus of the commission that that's our intent then with that? Okay.
And obviously, depending on the roadway segment, we can't always fit everything within the default street standards, so that doesn't change, but I completely support the way Brooke phrased it. He phrased it much better than I did.
And my intent is if we do have a situation where something has to give, we have a design exception process. If it's something like 14th, where we were working through various cross-sections and configurations here in Fifth Street, we would be bringing it to the commission to discuss our options.
So I think you've got our input then on that item?
Yep.
Okay. All right, with that, I believe, next thing is subcommittee and liaison assignment updates. We don't have subcommittees.
That's your old,
That's our old one. We don't have subcommittees anymore. So we'll just move to long-range calendar. So Jennifer, do you want to give us an overview on the long-range calendar, please?
sure. We are in December, I'm gonna oh, 2025, so we're about to have January 2025. Ryan's gonna bring traffic study guidelines for developments to you, and at the annual speed hump survey, we have 2 streets that we're proposing to place speed humps on, that we're gonna be surveying the residents in January. We'll be bringing that item to you. In February, we're gonna do an update on all of our transportation grants, and then we're also going to invite our Safe Routes to School coordinator to come and give you an introduction and her programming for the year. And then in March, we're planning to bring our Anderson Road 30% plans. That's it.
All right, thank you very much. Since we have no public, I'm not gonna worry about public comment on the Okay, so with that, I guess, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 All opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you all very much for your input this evening. Thank you, Jennifer,